Hi everyone, welcome to the lumber mill. Today we're going to be cutting these rough cuts into something a little bit more refined, and then we'll be building something out of it while it's unseasoned. Alright, so this pile of lumber here is all from the same hunk of tree that I milled. Unfortunately it's pretty wavy because the initial few blades I was using were pretty bad, and it takes a good 30 minutes or so to really sharpen one of these 12-foot bandsaw blades, and sometimes I'm just not up for it, so I just try to kind of limp along. And of course, immediately in my first cut, after I did spend the half hour sharpening it, which was going beautifully, I hit a metal bolt, steel bolt in the wood, and it's still cut fairly straight the rest of the tree, but it's done at this point, so I'm going to have to spend another half hour just sharpening another 12-foot blade, which is why I don't like doing it very often. That, and this used to be a farm, so there are bits of metal in all the trees pretty much, from all of the fences that were hung on trees and posts and things along the way for cattle. Anyway, so I have a pretty good start here. The general dimensions are going to be about 16 feet long by 8 feet wide, and this is going to be used for replacing my Harbor Freight carports that failed miserably. So I'm just gonna do it right, like I should have to begin with. I have here my rough dimensions. So I'm going to be doing a 412 pitch, which is about 18 degrees. So everything will be cut for that 18 degrees. I have my total lengths and wall lengths and the height. So this is pretty much set. I'm just gonna have to roughly cut all this stuff. A few tools to speed things up. I have this set to 18 degrees. I have one of these, which is a bit oversized, which is nice. And I'm going to be trying out this blade that's designed for pressure-treated wood in the hopes that because this wood has not been seasoned, it will cut a little bit better since it's a bit wet. And yes, I'm going to be building this green, so it will actually season in place. This is not the first time I've done this. I do think there are a few precautions when you're doing things this way. One thing I like to do is use enameled screws. I also pre-drill every hole for the screws. So I would probably use screws anyway. I'm not a big fan of nails, but if you displace this without removing the material first, it will split. It may not split right away, but it will eventually split. And that's actually true of pretty much any kind of wood, including after it's been seasoned. You can go ahead and put a nail in it or a screw, and it may even say that it pre-drills it for you as you're drilling it in, but it doesn't really. It will eventually, after a few years, split, especially when exposed to weather. So I always pre-drill everything, but it's especially important when you're doing things green. Roughly all of this stuff is about 3.5 by 3.5 for the posts, or about 1.5 in thickness by some arbitrary width. Now there is all this waviness, but I'm not entirely sure it's worth correcting, so that's a bit up in the air. Some of this will become more like a 2x4, some of it will be the ridge beam, so that will probably be fairly thick still. Maybe, I don't know, it depends on the design, but at 16 feet it's possible this will actually have some pretty heavy-duty load. So for example, maybe this particularly large piece here will end up being a ridge beam or something like that. The 4x4s will obviously end up being the legs. Those are 16 feet, roughly, maybe 18, so it's questionable whether I want to put those into the earth or not, because they'll rot for one. And the second reason is that I don't really have enough length to get 2 out of it if I was to put, say, 2 feet into the ground, which is what I would normally do. But given that it's green, given that it's pine, I know that you stick untreated pine into the earth, and that'll buy you about a year, maybe 2 if you're lucky, before it's completely rotted and eaten away. It's a bit of a pain, but when cutting this rough stuff, I pretty much always use a circular saw. After years of mucking around with my miter saw, it's just not really worth it. So what I do is I use my tape measure, get a mark in place, and then from there I just run it around into a C shape wrapping around the board, and then I just do 2 cuts. One on the top and then flip it, then one on the bottom. It's funny how small 8 feet feels when you're used to dealing with 16 or 18 feet. Alright, so here I'm doing roughly a 2x6, which is 1.5 inches thick by 5.5 inches in height or width. The length is going to be 16 feet, but there will be posts, probably at least 3 posts, one in the middle and one on each side. Then I did a perpendicular line to the line that I drew here. Actually used an existing, it's supposed to be about a 1x10 or 12. So I used that as a template, or rather as a straight edge, and I just marked and did some rough work and approximating. You can see here I'm a little bit off, but it doesn't really matter for this application. And keep in mind, this wood's going to do whatever it wants anyway. So when you're building green, things may torsion, they may warp, those sorts of things. You can't really control it, and the wood is not also at its maximum strength. So it's not the kind of thing you want to build a house green unless maybe it's totally off the radar from any kind of code enforcement. For example, this is not graded. You cannot have a permit for building with ungraded lumber, no matter what type it is. It's just not something that you're allowed to do. So if it's a non-structural application, or if it's an application that is not something people are living in and is not being permitted, then you can do whatever you want, you know, it's your land. If you're building a shed, for example, you could probably get away with using, you know, lumber you cut yourself. But if you're building a house in the city or in a place where there's permitting and a process of inspection, there's just no way you'd get away with it. Cleaned up one edge here with the circular saw. I'm just going to brush all this sawdust off. Some of the imperfections are actually from the safety on the circular saw. I know that sounds bizarre to a lot of people probably, but I've probably almost been in over 100 accidents from the guard on circular saws because it wants to constantly spring down and knock your blade off. Like it wants to push your blade away from the right angle because it gets caught on the edge of what you're working with. It's just a constant pain. Many a times I have shimmed and wedged this thing open. The only problem is then you have to wait before you set it down or you'll hit dirt. But I've done a heck of a lot of trimming of boards with this thing wedged open. Alright, here you can see my finished board, and it's pretty rough. I kind of let the circular saw try to fly straight, but one of the gotchas when you're cutting this stuff is it will have natural like pinch points or warps and such inside of it, which when the board is fully connected is not an issue, but then once you start cutting through it, it may just start pinching on you or other things. So it's easy to have that happen, and so you may end up even having to do like 2 cuts, one shallow and then one deeper. So this is 16 feet long, 2x6. Decent result. You can see one of the major issues if you were grading this would be this big knot right here, this eye, because this is a major compromise right here in terms of the integrity. Once this was dry, a little bit less of an issue, but certainly an issue when wet, and not great when dry either. Thankfully that does land about at the center, so there will be a post supporting that, so it's not a big deal. Another one right here, which would be kind of an issue given the size of it. Other things would be like the grain off by 15 degrees. So this is all fairly parallel in terms of the grain. If you were cutting the grain and it was more than 15 degrees from parallel, then it would not really work for a structural application. It would be a problem because then what will happen is a whole section of board will just chip right off. So it has to be parallel with the grain for the most part. I would guess if this was graded, it would probably be grade 3, or just barely on the edge of structural. Check out this board here. The problem is, the more I cut this board, the less it's worth. Right now it's at over 12 inches. It's around 14 inches the entire length of it, which is about 18 feet. This is a pretty valuable board, but I don't need it to be 14 inches. For reference, my 21-foot header holding up those doors It's only about 12 inches in the width, or the height, I suppose. So to support a 21-foot header, you only need about 12 inches. Of course, that is approximately 6 inches in depth, because everything in there is 2x6 construction. But nonetheless, point being, I mean, this board, even wet like it is, could hold up a car. I mean, this thing is a strong board. So if I was a commercial mill, I could probably make more by dividing this up. Maybe. But I'm not a commercial mill, so the more effort I put into this, the more its value drops and the more work I have to do. So it's unfortunate, but I'm going to have to cut it down. I might cut this down to around 8 inches, something like that. And I won't be able to get 2 sets of 8 inches, that would be 16. So I'll get maybe a 2x6 equivalent and a 2x8 equivalent out of it, something along those lines. So you may be wondering, is it actually worth your time to mill wood into boards and to do things along those lines for construction purposes? And the answer is almost always no, it's not. Now, even with something like pine, you probably could break even or even make money if, for example, this was turned into a tabletop of some kind. You know, if this was nicely planed into a custom table or something, it'd probably be worth quite a bit. But it's not. The only thing that I have around here that's actually worth my time to mill versus my time as a professional would probably be the oak. Oak is expensive enough that you could actually justify milling that and selling it as wood, probably, in terms of the time equivalent. In terms of the mill investment, yeah, it's going to take a while to break even, probably. I know I have, for a fact, well broken even. I have probably milled well over $10,000 worth of wood, but you know, that's over the course of years. So if you were to do any kind of custom woodworking, though, like if you are a woodworker and you have trees and you want to do especially large projects, you know, a mill would be absolutely worth the value, because you're going to be selling custom pieces of work. It's hard to find pieces of wood like this, for example. You know, even though this is just some crappy yellow pine, these dimensions are hard to get. And the other thing is logistics. You know, how much time does it take for that to be delivered to you and that sort of thing if it's a custom piece. Obviously, if you're dealing with oak, it's a whole other world, because that's a hardwood that's worth more in general because it grows much more slowly. But even something like this piece of pine is pretty valuable. So something to keep in mind if you're planning to get a mill and maybe mill wood like I do. You know, I've saved a lot of money by doing it, but I've used a lot of time at the same time, and my time is always more valuable as a professional than doing almost anything else I can do, short of maybe if I mass-produced an invention or something along those lines. But the way I see it, this allows me to learn something, it allows me to work with my hands, and it burns calories, gets me in shape, it gets me out of the house, gets me some sunlight. You know, things that I'd have to pay for. I could just be a blob at my computer all day, or I could actually go outside and get something constructive done. And, you know, versus sitting at a computer then paying a gym membership fee. Okay, so what did we get from that tree? That was, let's say, roughly 20 inches in diameter. We got 3 2x6x16s, 2 2x10x16s, 5 2x4x16s, and 8 4x4x8. So this is a good start to my lumber yard for drying. I still have to do my final cuts for the roofing aspects of it, and I'd like to do some notching as well on these posts for holding the 2x6s. But I think I'm going to call it a day for now. I actually just checked the time and it's only around 5, so I spent a little under 2 hours on cutting all of these out with the circular saw for reference. Which is pretty good, because this was the sort of final cut to make this dimensional from the mill. And the milling would have gone pretty quickly, probably about 60 to 90 minutes if the blades were already sharpened. So I guess to give you an idea, it'd be about 3 hours or so to get all of this to final dimension. I do actually have an example of something built entirely green, and it's lasted years now. I don't know, at least 4 years, and no real signs of issues. But it's actually really just kind of poorly and hastily done. But you can see the center post here for supporting it is actually off of the support, and it really didn't affect things pretty much at all. So this stuff is amply strong. There's no bowing. Everything looks decent. And you can see even on these boards that are just kind of barely the correct dimensions, if at all, it's totally fine. In fact, this wood had been sitting out for a while too, so it's not even fresh. So it even started to decay a bit. And in spite of all of that, it has no bowing, has been up for years, and the insects haven't really touched it much either. So it's completely fine. And this was built entirely green and seasoned in place. The only thing protecting it is this roof that's full of small holes. So just to give you an idea, things are so overbuilt to begin with that they will last in reality for a long, long time. Just for reference as an example, a 4x4, which is really about 3.5 by 3.5, can easily hold compressively over 16,000 pounds. And that's just that little size. So you have to screw up pretty badly to have a structural collapse of something that's made out of wood and held together correctly with the correct fixtures. Because the wood itself, as long as you build intelligently with it, will last a long time and will hold a huge amount of weight.